The Montana high plains stretched empty and white as far as sight could reach, the landscape erased by snow that had been falling for 3 days straight without pause or mercy. Clay Morgan stood at the edge of his property, watching the storm build on the western horizon, dark clouds stacked like bruises against a sky that had forgotten what blue looked like. He was 47 years old and looked every year of it, his face lined by wind and solitude, his hands rough from work that never quite filled the silence left when his wife had passed 5 winters ago. The only company he kept now was Ranger, a buckskin gelding with a white blaze, and the kind of intelligence that made Clay wonder sometimes if horses understood more than humans gave them credit for. Ranger stood beside him now, ears swiveling toward the approaching storm, his breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned to inhale. "We've got maybe 2 hours before that hits," Clay said, speaking more to himself than the horse, though Ranger's ear twitched in acknowledgement. "Need to check the north fence line. Cattle break through in weather like this. They'll freeze before we find them." He saddled Ranger with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the task 10,000 times, each movement economical and precise. The leather was stiff from cold despite the barn's relative warmth, and Clay's fingers fumbled slightly with the buckles. Age and arthritis making tasks that had once been effortless now require conscious thought and effort. They rode out into the gathering storm, Ranger picking his way carefully through drifts that had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. The wind was rising, carrying with it the particular howl that meant the blizzard would be serious, the kind that buried fence posts and killed livestock and reminded humans that nature held final authority over all their plans and preparations. Clay had lived through dozens of Montana winters, but this one felt different, harder, like the cold had teeth and was actively hunting rather than just existing. He pulled his coat tighter and urged Ranger forward, trusting the horse to find solid footing where Clay's eyes could no longer distinguish ground from drift. They were 3 miles from the ranch house, approaching the narrow canyon where the north property line ran along rock walls that provided shelter from the worst winds, when Ranger stopped dead. Not a gradual halt, a complete freeze, every muscle locked, his head coming up sharply and nostrils flaring to test air for information Clay's human senses couldn't detect. Clay had learned over 15 years with this horse to trust these moments. Ranger's instincts had warned him of mountain lions, unstable ground, approaching storms before they became visible. "What is it, boy?" Clay asked, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Ranger turned his head toward the canyon, took 2 deliberate steps in that direction, then stopped again and looked back at Clay. The message was clear. Something was there, something that required investigation. Clay guided Ranger into the canyon's mouth, the rock walls cutting the wind to a more manageable howl. And that's when he saw it, a shape against the far wall that shouldn't be there, too dark to be snow, too still to be an animal moving. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made Clay's heart constrict with shock and disbelief. A girl, maybe 12 years old, curled into a ball against the rock, her thin coat covered in snow, her arms wrapped around something that shifted and whimpered with the unmistakable sound of newborn animals in distress. Clay had ridden out to save cattle, but he had just stumbled upon a tragedy he never expected. But real quick, before we see if he can get them out of there alive. If you enjoy these kinds of intense survival stories, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss an upload. Now, let's see if the girl was still breathing. 3 foals. So, young their legs were still uncertain, their coats matted and wet from birth, pressed against the girl's body while she tried desperately to shield them from the killing cold with nothing but her own inadequate warmth. Clay was off Ranger before conscious thought caught up with action, his boots crunching through snow as he approached carefully, not wanting to startle a child who looked half frozen and entirely terrified. "Hey," he said softly, his voice gentle despite the urgency hammering in his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you, but we need to get you somewhere warm, you and these babies both." The girl's eyes opened, brown and fierce despite the cold that had turned her lips blue. She pulled the foals closer, her arms trembling from cold and effort. "Don't take them," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please! They'll die without someone to keep them warm. Their mama—" her voice broke. "Their mama died trying to protect them." Clay looked around and spotted it then. The body of a mare partially buried in snow 20 feet away, her neck bent at an unnatural angle, her eyes glazed with the particular emptiness of recent death. She'd collapsed, probably from exhaustion and cold, and the fall had broken something vital. But before she died, she had given birth to 3 foals who now had no source of warmth or milk or protection, except a 12-year-old girl who'd chosen to stay with them rather than save herself. "What's your name?" Clay asked, kneeling beside the girl despite the cold soaking through his jeans. "Hannah. Hannah, I'm Clay, and I promise you, I swear on everything I have, I will not let these foals die. But we have to move now. There's a blizzard coming that will kill all of you if we stay here. Do you understand?" Hannah studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read adults for signs of lies and violence. Whatever she saw must have passed some internal test, because she nodded slowly. "Okay, but I have to come with them. They're scared. They need me." "You can come. You're all coming." Clay stood and moved to Ranger, pulling the emergency sled from where it was strapped behind his saddle, a flat platform on runners designed for transporting injured calves or emergency supplies. He'd never imagined he'd be loading 3 newborn foals onto it while a blizzard gathered strength overhead. The foals resisted initially, their instincts telling them to fear humans, but Hannah spoke to them in a voice that was surprisingly calm for someone clearly on the edge of hypothermia. "It's okay. He's going to help us. We have to trust him." Clay wrapped each foal in the emergency blankets he carried, securing them to the sled with rope that he hoped would hold. Then he lifted Hannah. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and determination, and placed her behind him on Ranger's saddle. "Hold on tight to me. Don't let go no matter what happens." "I won't." Clay urged Ranger forward, the horse responding immediately despite the additional weight and the awkward sled dragging behind. They'd barely made it 50 yards back up the canyon when Ranger stopped again, this time with his ears pinned back and his entire body tense with warning. "What?" Clay started to ask, but the sound answered before he could finish. A deep rumble, building rapidly, the unmistakable roar of snow breaking free from the canyon walls above them. Avalanche. Ranger didn't wait for Clay's command. The horse lunged forward, pulling the sled with strength born from survival instinct, his hooves finding purchase on ground that seemed determined to betray them. Hannah's arms tightened around Clay's waist, her face pressed against his back, and Clay leaned forward, giving Ranger his head, trusting the horse to find the path that would keep them ahead of the wall of snow that was chasing them down the narrow canyon. They burst from the canyon mouth seconds before the avalanche hit, the roar deafening, snow and rock cascading down to bury the trail they had just traveled. If they'd been 30 seconds slower, if Ranger hadn't sensed the danger and moved when he did, they'd all be buried under tons of snow with no hope of rescue. Clay pulled Ranger to a stop once they had reached safe distance, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the wind. He turned to look at Hannah, who was white-faced and shaking, her eyes wide with the understanding of how close they'd just come to death. "You okay?" Clay asked. Hannah nodded, though her entire body was trembling, from cold, from shock, from the accumulated trauma of whatever had brought her to this point. "The foals?" Clay checked the sled. All 3 were still secured, still breathing, their dark eyes reflecting fear, but also the resilience that young things possessed when they hadn't yet learned to give up. "They're alive. Let's get home before that storm hits." The ride back to the ranch house took 40. Minutes that felt like hours, the wind building with every passing minute, visibility dropping until Clay was navigating by memory and faith, trusting Ranger to follow the route he'd walked hundreds of times. By the time the barn appeared through the blowing snow, Clay's face was numb, and Hannah had stopped shivering, a bad sign that meant her body was shutting down systems to preserve core temperature. Clay carried the foals into the barn one by one, Hannah stumbling behind him on legs that barely functioned. He settled the babies in the largest stall, switching on the heat lamps he kept for emergencies, layering them with every blanket he could find. Then he turned his attention to Hannah, who'd collapsed against the stall wall, her eyes half closed. "Stay with me," Clay commanded, his voice sharp to cut through the fog of hypothermia. "You've kept them alive this long. Don't quit now." Hannah's eyes opened, focusing with effort. "I'm trying." Clay half carried her to the ranch house, getting her inside where warmth hit like a physical blow. He wrapped her in blankets, forced hot tea into her hands, and watched her color slowly return from death, white to something closer to living pink. "Thank you," Hannah whispered after she'd drunk half the tea. for believing me, for saving them. You saved them first, Clay replied. You stayed with them when most people would have run for help or saved themselves. That took courage. Or stupidity. Hannah's smile was weak but genuine. My mom used to say I cared too much about animals and not enough about keeping myself safe. Your mom sounds smart. Where is she? Does she know you're out here? The smile disappeared. Hannah's hands tightened around the tea mug, and Clay saw something flicker across her face. Fear mixed with shame, mixed with a resignation that no 12-year-old should possess. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. After that, it was just me and my stepfather. And he... Hannah stopped, the words catching in her throat. Clay waited, giving her space to continue or retreat as she needed. Outside, the blizzard hit in full force, wind screaming around the house, snow hammering against windows. They were isolated now, cut off from the outside world for however long the storm lasted. He's mean, Hannah finally said, the words quiet but weighted with accumulated hurt. He drinks, and when he's drunk, he gets angry. He bought that mare cheap because she was old and he thought he could use her for work. But when she couldn't pull like he wanted, he'd hit her. Beat her sometimes when I tried to stop him. Clay felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice level. Is that why you ran? He was going to sell the foals, said they were worthless mouths to feed, and he'd get what he could for them at auction. But they were just born. They'd die without their mother. And their mother died because he worked her too hard while she was pregnant, and she just gave out. Hannah's voice broke. I couldn't let him take them, so I took them first. I thought maybe I could find someone who'd care for them properly. But then the mare died and the storm came, and I thought we'd all die together. You didn't die, and neither did they. Because of you and your horse. Clay thought about Ranger, about the way the gelding had stopped and insisted on investigating the canyon, about the split-second warning before the avalanche, about the strength and intelligence that had gotten them all home alive. Ranger's special. He always knows when something's wrong before I do. He saved us. Hannah's eyes were closing, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. Tell him thank you. You can tell him yourself. Tomorrow. Right now, you need to sleep. You're safe here, I promise. Hannah was asleep before Clay finished speaking, her small body finally releasing the tension that had been keeping her upright through sheer force of will. Clay watched her for a moment, this fierce child who'd risked her life to save 3 helpless animals from a man who should have protected her instead of becoming the thing she needed protection from. Then he returned to the barn to check on the foals. The blizzard raged for 2 days, burying the ranch under 3 feet of snow and cutting off all communication with the outside world. Clay spent the time moving between the house and barn, caring for Hannah and the foals with the focused intensity of someone who understood that survival required constant vigilance. The foals were weaker than he'd hoped. Without their mother's milk, they were slowly starving despite the warmth and shelter. Clay mixed formula designed for orphaned calves, adjusting it for horses, and spent hours coaxing each foal to drink from a bottle. It was exhausting work that left his back aching and his hands cramped, but 2 of the 3 foals, the larger colt and the sturdy filly, began nursing regularly by the 2nd day. The 3rd foal, a smaller colt with a white star on his forehead, remained worryingly weak. He would drink a little, then turn away, his eyes dull with exhaustion that went beyond normal newborn fatigue. Clay recognized the signs. This one might not make it. Sometimes the smallest in a multiple birth just didn't have the reserves to survive without their mother. Hannah spent every waking moment with the foals, talking to them softly, helping Clay with feedings, arranging blankets to keep them warm. And Ranger, who Clay had brought into the barn to escape the worst of the storm, stood guard outside their stall like a sentinel, occasionally reaching his head over to nuzzle the babies with surprising gentleness, for a gelding who'd never been around foals before. He likes them, Hannah observed, watching Ranger interact with the nursing colt. He's like their uncle or something. Or their guardian, Clay replied. Horses are herd animals. They protect their own. And for some reason, Ranger's decided these 3 are his responsibility. Like, you decided I'm yours? Clay looked at Hannah, surprised by the directness of the question. You're not a responsibility. You're a person who needed help. And I'm someone who can provide it. That's how communities are supposed to work. I haven't been part of a community in a long time. Hannah's voice was quiet, After Mom died, it was just me and him, and he made it clear I was a burden, that he was doing me a favor by not sending me to foster care. Like, I should be grateful he hit me instead of abandoning me completely. The casual way she said it, like abuse was just another weather condition to be endured, made Clay's jaw tighten. That's not how families work, and it's definitely not something you should be grateful for. I know, Mom would have been so angry if she knew, but she's not here to protect me anymore, so I have to protect myself, and things that can't protect themselves. She gestured to the foals, and Clay understood then that Hannah's fierce defense of these animals wasn't just compassion, it was projection. She was saving them because no one had saved her. She was giving them the protection she'd been denied. You did good, Clay told her. Saving them, staying with them even when it put you in danger. That took real courage. Courage or stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing. Hannah smiled, a real smile this time, one that transformed her thin face and made her look like the child she should have been allowed to be. My mom used to say that too. The storm broke on the third morning, revealing a world transformed by snow into something pristine and impossibly beautiful. Clay dug out paths to the barn and the road, knowing that as soon as the county plows came through, the isolation would end and reality would intrude on the fragile peace they had built. He was shoveling the driveway when he heard the truck engine, a diesel rumble that carried across the quiet landscape long before the vehicle appeared. Clay stopped working and felt his stomach tighten with anticipation that bordered on dread. The truck that emerged from the tree line was old and dirty, its tailgate missing and its front bumper held on with wire. It pulled up to Clay's driveway and stopped, engine still running, exhaust billowing in the cold air. The man who climbed out was in his 40s, heavy-set, with a face that might have been handsome before alcohol, and anger had carved permanent lines of meanness into his features. He wore a canvas coat and work boots and an expression that broadcast he was used to getting his way through intimidation rather than reason. "You Clay Morgan?" the man called out, not bothering to approach, just standing by his truck like he owned the place. "I am. Who's asking?" "Name's Roger Finch. I'm looking for my stepdaughter. Girl named Hannah, about 12 years old. Someone in town said they saw your horse heading back here during the storm with extra cargo." His eyes were cold, calculating. "Thought maybe you found her?" Clay kept his expression neutral. "Why would your stepdaughter be out in a blizzard?" "She ran away, took some valuable livestock with her, horses that belong to me." Roger took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "So, I'm going to ask you straight, is she here, and are my animals here? If you're talking about 3 newborn foals and a girl who nearly froze to death protecting them, then yes, they're here. The girl's safe, and the foals are alive despite your mare dying from exhaustion and neglect." Roger's face darkened. "That mare was old. She collapsed on her own. That's not neglect, that's nature. And those foals are my property. I'll be taking them and the girl back now." "No?" The word came out flat and final. "Excuse me?" I said no. "Hannah stays here until I'm sure she's safe, and the foals stay here until they're strong enough to survive on their own. After that, we can talk about what happens next." Roger's expression shifted from surprise to rage. "You got no right to keep my property. That's theft. That's kidnapping. I can call the sheriff right now and have you arrested." "Go ahead. Call him. I'll tell him how I found a 12-year-old girl wrapped around 3 dying foals in a blizzard. I'll tell him about the bruises on her arms. I'll tell him about the dead mare that died from being worked while pregnant. And then, we'll see who gets arrested." The 2 men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Clay was conscious of his age, of the fact that Roger was younger and heavier and probably had violence in his background that Clay didn't. But Clay had something Roger didn't, certainty that he was right, and the stubbornness that came from having nothing left to lose except his conscience. "This isn't over," Roger finally said, his voice low and threatening. "I'll be back, with the sheriff, with lawyers, and I'll take what's mine." He climbed back into his truck and roared away, spraying snow and exhaust, leaving Clay standing in the driveway with the understanding that the easy part was over. The real fight was about to begin. Clay found Hannah in the barn, her face pressed against Ranger's neck, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She'd obviously heard the confrontation. "He found me," she whispered. "He's going to make me go back." "No, he's not." Clay's voice was firm. "I won't let that happen. You can't stop him. He's my legal guardian, and the foals are his property. The law's on his side. The law's on the side of protecting children from abuse, and the evidence of abuse is written all over you. Clay gently lifted Hannah's sleeve, revealing the purple-yellow bruises that covered her forearm. Those tell a story that any decent sheriff will listen to. But what if they don't believe me? What if they say I'm lying? Then we make them believe you, together. Hannah looked up at him with eyes that held too much experience with disappointment to fully trust hope. But underneath the wariness, Clay saw something else, the desperate want to believe that maybe, just maybe, adults could be something other than threats to be survived. "Why are you helping me?" Hannah asked. "You don't know me? I'm just some kid who brought you trouble." "You're not trouble. You're a brave girl who did the right thing even when it was hard and dangerous. And you remind me—" Clay stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless." "Your wife?" Clay nodded. "She'd have done exactly what you did. Protected the helpless, stood up to bullies, refused to let cruelty go unchallenged." He paused. "She would have liked you." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then she straightened her shoulders and wiped her eyes. "Okay, we fight. But I need you to know, he's dangerous. Roger. He's not just mean. He's violent, especially when he's been drinking. If he comes back, he'll find out that threatening a child on my property was a mistake he won't get to repeat." That night, Clay called the county sheriff, a man named Dennis Carter, who Clay had known for 20 years. He explained the situation carefully, emphasizing the abandoned foals, Hannah's injuries, the dead mare, and Roger's threatening behavior. Dennis listened without interrupting, then sighed heavily. "Clay, you know I have to investigate this properly. Roger's claims about kidnapping and theft, those are serious. I need to interview the girl, get her side of the story. She'll tell you the truth. But Dennis, she's terrified. She needs to know she's safe before she'll talk openly. I'll be gentle, but if there's evidence of abuse, I have to follow protocol. Child services will get involved. There'll be an investigation. It's going to get complicated. Complicated I can handle. What I can't handle is sending her back to someone who hurts her." "Understood. I'll be there tomorrow morning." Clay spent the evening preparing Hannah for the interview, explaining that she needed to be honest, that the bruises would speak for themselves, that telling the truth was the only way to ensure she never had to go back to Roger's house. "But what if they put me in foster care anyway?" Hannah asked, her voice small. "What if I end up somewhere worse? Then I'll apply to be your foster parent, temporarily, until things get sorted out." The words came out before Clay had fully thought them through, but once said, he realized he meant them completely. Hannah stared at him. "You do that? Take in someone else's kid? Deal with all the legal stuff and the hassle? You're not a hassle. You're a person who deserves safety and stability, and this ranch has room for both." For the first time since Clay had found her in the snow, Hannah's face broke into a genuine smile, wide and unguarded and transformative. "Thank you for everything. Thank me by getting some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Around 2 in the morning, Clay was jolted awake by a sound that made his blood run cold. Ranger's alarm whinny, the high-pitched scream horses made when they sensed danger. Clay grabbed his shotgun and ran for the barn, his heart hammering. The barn door was open. He knew he'd latched it, and inside, he could hear Ranger's aggressive snorts and the sound of someone cursing. Clay hit the lights and found Roger Finch trying to load the foals into a trailer he'd backed up to the barn entrance. Ranger was between Roger and the foals, his ears pinned back, his teeth bared in a display of aggression that would have been comical if it wasn't so deadly serious. "Get away from those animals!" Clay commanded, raising the shotgun. Roger spun around, his face twisted with rage and alcohol. "They're mine. You got no right to break into my barn in the middle of the night. That's trespassing. That's attempted theft. And if you take one more step toward those foals or toward my house where Hannah's sleeping, I will put you down like the threat you are." For a moment, Clay thought Roger would charge him anyway, drunk enough and angry enough to ignore the weapon. But Ranger lunged forward, teeth snapping inches from Roger's shoulder, and the man stumbled backward with a curse. "This is my property." The law can sort out property disputes in daylight with proper procedure. Right now, you're committing multiple crimes on my land. Leave, now. Or I call the sheriff and have you arrested." Roger retreated to his truck, shouting threats about lawsuits and revenge, but he left. Clay watched until the taillights disappeared, then secured the barn properly and spent the rest of the night sitting guard with Ranger, both of them protecting the sleeping foals and the girl in the house who had already survived more than any child should have to. When Sheriff Carter arrived the next morning, Clay had a clear story to tell, backed up by evidence of forced entry and Ranger's defensive behavior. Hannah gave her statement with surprising strength, showing her bruises, explaining Roger's treatment of both her and the mare, describing the fear that had finally made her run. Child Services was called. A social worker arrived with gentle questions and careful documentation. And by the end of the day, temporary custody was granted to Clay, pending a full investigation into Roger's fitness as a guardian. Roger was arrested that evening on charges of animal cruelty, child endangerment, trespassing, and attempted burglary. The foals were officially seized as evidence of neglect, and Hannah was told she could stay at the ranch while the legal process unfolded. "How long will that take?" she asked the social worker, her voice cautious. "Could be months, could be longer, but Mr. Morgan has agreed to foster you during that time, if you're comfortable with that arrangement." Hannah looked at Clay, her eyes asking a question she didn't quite know how to voice. "You're welcome here as long as you need to be," Clay said simply. "No strings, no conditions, just a safe place while things get sorted out." "And the foals? They stay too. We're a package deal now." Spring came to Montana slowly, the snow retreating reluctantly to reveal brown earth and the first brave shoots of green grass. The foals had grown impossibly fast, their stick-thin legs developing muscle, their coats losing the baby fuzz and taking on the sleek shine of health. Even the smallest colt, the one Clay had worried wouldn't survive, had rallied, his personality revealing itself as stubborn and affectionate in equal measure. Hannah named them carefully, after weeks of consideration. The largest colt became Thunder, for the sound of his increasingly confident hoofbeats. The filly was Grace, for the elegant way she moved despite her size. And the smallest colt was Hope, because that's what he'd given them all when he'd chosen to live instead of die. The legal proceedings had been exactly as complicated as Dennis had predicted. Roger fought the charges viciously, hiring lawyers who argued that Clay had interfered in family business, that Hannah was a troubled child who'd run away for attention, that the mare's death was unfortunate but not criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming, the bruises photographed on Hannah's arms and back, the testimony of neighbors who had heard screaming from Roger's property but had been too afraid to intervene, the veterinarian's report on the mare's condition at death, underweight, overworked, showing signs of repeated physical trauma, and most damning, the discovery during a search of Roger's property of additional animal remains, horses and dogs buried in shallow graves, all showing evidence of abuse. The judge had been swift and final. Roger's parental rights were terminated. He was convicted of multiple counts of animal cruelty and child endangerment, and he was banned from owning animals for life. Hannah's custody was officially transferred to Clay, who'd spent months navigating the foster system, attending classes, passing inspections, proving he could provide a stable home for a traumatized child. It wasn't easy. The bureaucracy was endless, the scrutiny intense. But Clay had endured it with the same patient determination he applied to training horses and surviving Montana winters. And somewhere in the process of fighting for Hannah's right to stay, something had shifted in Clay's isolated existence. The ranch that had been a refuge from grief became a home again. The silence that had felt like peace revealed itself as loneliness, and the child who'd arrived wrapped around dying foals in a blizzard became the daughter he'd never known he needed. They developed routines, morning chores together, Hannah learning to feed and care for animals with Clay's patient instruction, afternoons spent training the growing foals, teaching them to lead and stand for grooming and accept human touch as kindness rather than threat. Evenings in the ranch house, Clay teaching Hannah to cook simple meals, Hannah teaching Clay that television shows could actually be enjoyable if you watch them with someone else. And always, Ranger was there, standing guard over the foals, carrying Hannah on trail rides, serving as the steady presence that anchored everyone else's healing. The horse that had sensed trouble in a canyon and refused to ignore it. The horse that had warned of avalanches and midnight intruders. The horse that had somehow known that finding that girl would save everyone involved, not just her. On the first anniversary of Hannah's rescue, they held a small ceremony at the ranch. Just Clay, Hannah, Sheriff Dennis, and the social worker who'd become a friend through the process. They stood in the barn where the foals, now yearlings, tall and strong, investigated everything with the confidence of horses who'd never known anything but kindness. "I want to say something," Hannah announced, her voice still uncertain about claiming space but stronger than it had been. "A year ago, I thought I was going to die in that canyon. I thought the foals would die. And I was okay with that, because at least we'd be together, and we wouldn't have to be scared anymore." She paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Clay rested his hand on her shoulder, offering support without pressure. But then Clay and Ranger found us, and they saved us, all of us. And they didn't just save our lives, they gave us a reason to keep living, taught us that not all people are cruel, that broken things can heal if someone cares enough to help them. Hannah looked at Clay. "You gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one again. You gave the foals a home when they should have died. You gave all of us a second chance." "You gave me a second chance too," Clay replied, his voice thick. "This ranch was just a place I existed after Ann died. You made it a home again. You reminded me that life is about more than just surviving, that there are still things worth protecting and people worth fighting for." Hannah moved forward and hugged Clay fiercely, and Clay wrapped his arms around this fierce, brave child who'd risked everything to save creatures that couldn't save themselves. Behind them, the yearlings, Thunder, Grace, and Hope, watched with calm curiosity, completely unaware of the miracle of their own survival, of the chain of events that had started with a stubborn horse refusing to ignore trouble and ended with a family that nobody had planned but everyone needed. Ranger stood at his stall door, watching the gathered humans with the patient understanding of horses who'd spent millennia observing human drama and learning that sometimes the best thing you could do was just be present, just be steady, just refuse to give up on the lost things until they found their way home. That evening, after everyone else had left, Clay and Hannah sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The yearlings were in the pasture, racing each other in games that looked like play, but were actually the serious business of young horses, learning their strength and testing their limits. Ranger stood among them, not racing but watching, the guardian who'd brought them all together and never once doubted his role in their survival. "Do you ever think about that day?" Hannah asked quietly. "Finding us in the canyon? Do you wonder what would have happened if Ranger hadn't stopped? If you just kept riding?" "Every day," Clay admitted. "And every day I'm grateful he knew something I didn't. That he trusted his instincts when logic said there was nothing to investigate. My mom used to say that animals know things humans forgot, that they can sense good and bad in ways we can't anymore, because we think too much and feel too little." Hannah leaned against Clay's shoulder. "I think Ranger knew we needed each other, all of us, and he made sure we found each other even though it should have been impossible. Maybe, or maybe we were just lucky. I don't think it was luck. I think it was meant to happen. You were supposed to find us. We were supposed to be a family. The universe just used a smart horse to make sure we didn't miss each other." Clay smiled at the certainty in her voice, at the faith that had survived so much trauma and somehow emerged intact. "Your mom sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was, and she would have really liked you, and Ranger, and this place." Hannah was quiet for a moment, watching the yearlings play. "I think she'd be happy knowing I ended up here, that I found a home where people don't hurt each other and animals are treated with kindness, where being soft isn't weakness and caring too much is actually a strength. She'd be proud of you for surviving, for staying brave when everything was terrifying, for choosing to save those foals instead of just saving yourself. I couldn't leave them, just like you couldn't leave us once Ranger found us. Some things you just have to do, even when they're hard, even when they're dangerous, because that's what makes us human instead of just animals surviving." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent and stars began emerging one by one. In the pasture, the yearlings finally tired of their games and settled down to graze, Ranger moving among them with the contentment of a creature who'd completed his mission and found peace in the accomplishment. The Montana night wrapped around them, cold and vast and infinite, but the ranch was warm with light and life, and the quiet miracle of broken things becoming whole when they found the right place to heal. A man who'd lost his wife and isolated himself from the world. A girl who'd been abused and abandoned by the person meant to protect her. 3 foals who should have died in the snow on their first day of life. And a horse wise enough to know that sometimes saving others was the only way to save yourself. They had found each other in a blizzard, guided by instinct and courage, and the refusal to accept that some things were beyond saving. And from that impossible rescue had grown something none of them could have predicted. A family built not on blood or law, but on the simple revolutionary act of choosing to care when it would have been easier to walk away. The stars multiplied overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their rescue and now witnessed their healing, and the Montana high plains that had nearly killed them all now cradled them safely. Transformed from a place of danger into a place of belonging, where abandoned things found purpose and broken hearts discovered they could still love if given patient reason and time enough to trust again.